Morning, everyone. Thanks for braving an 8:30 a.m. start. I hope you're caffeinated and ready. I'd like to acknowledge that we're joining on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. This land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For those of you I don't know, my name is Joanna Pradela. I'm the Director of Knowledge Translation and Equality Insights at the International Women's Development Agency, or IWDA. For any audience members who may have a vision impairment, I'm a relatively short, I'm told by my colleagues, white woman with brown curly hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a Barbie pink colored top today. We have a really fantastic group of panelists who are joining us this morning. And I don't want to take too much time away from them, but I do want to start this morning with a story. But before I do that, I also just want to acknowledge that the fantastic panelists that we have today are not the same fantastic panelists who are listed in the program, unfortunately. Due to competing pressures and some personal circumstances, we've done some swaps around. So I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but yes, just acknowledging that it's a different group of fantastic people this morning. So back to my story. In 2019, I was standing in this exact room at the Australasian Aid Conference of that year, presenting a paper on feminist foreign policy. And the paper was drawn from the outcomes of a workshop that IWDA held with partners at the International Center for Research on Women and Anne-Marie Goetz of New York University. And at that time, there were only 4 countries in the world who had declared a feminist foreign policy or a feminist international assistance policy. So they were Sweden, Canada, France, and Luxembourg. And of those, only Sweden had really moved substantially from a declaration of a feminist foreign policy to actually the sticky business of trying to implement it. So the paper that I was presenting was on the outcomes of that workshop, and the workshop was geared towards addressing the question of what should accountability for feminist foreign policy implementation look like. And the people in that workshop were predominantly women from the global south or the majority world, people who might often be considered to be the recipients of the foreign policy of the countries who had declared a feminist approach at that point. So I don't want to rehash the entire presentation. I'm sure it's online and you can go back and look at it. But in the Q&A with the audience, there was a political staffer in the room, and he asked me, what's been the pathway? How have countries gotten to a declaration of feminist foreign policy? And I remember thinking it was a great question, and my answer, I felt, was based more on anecdote than on evidence at the time. So IWDA set out about gathering that evidence. And I'm supposed to have a slide. Oops, sorry, Elise. That was you. There we go. So in mid-2021, we launched this publication up on the slide, From Seeds to Roots, Trajectories Towards Feminist Foreign Policy. And by the time that research was launched, an additional 3 countries had declared a feminist foreign policy, and a 4th was about to declare, and you can see those on the screen. And today, there are 13 countries who have a declared feminist foreign policy or feminist international assistance policy, and there are at least a handful of others who you might call FFP curious. But coming back to that 2021 research, what we found was that there were 5 main factors that influenced a country in their declaration of a feminist foreign policy. And I'm just going to emphasize the second one that's up on the screen right now, which is the role of civil society in creating a permissive and enabling environment for such a declaration. So we were super energized by this idea that civil society could provide the right conditions for a political leader to make this declaration. And so we took a research into action approach, and we set about constituting and convening the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. I hate acronyms, but AFFPC might be easier to say than the whole name. And the AFFPC has these 3 objectives at its heart. So the first is to demonstrate a really broad level of support for feminist foreign policy as an approach. And I just want to flick through, give you a bit of a flavor of some of the people who are sitting in the core group of the AFFPC. and some of the organizations who have endorsed the approaches of the AFFPC. And this is all part of giving that perspective that there's quite a broad level of support across diverse parts of the sector. The third objective, coming back, is around conducting targeted outreach to relevant political actors. But the second one is the one that we're really here to talk about today. And so this is about raising the level of discourse on the topic, making it more common, bringing it into the general debate so that more people hear and understand about a feminist foreign policy. And one of the ways that we've done that is through the Issues paper series. So as you can see, this is a bi-monthly publication exploring the practical application of feminist foreign policy to a key issue. And this really responded to the kinds of questions that we were getting at the time where we started talking really loudly about feminist foreign policy in the Australian context, which was people really wanting to pick an issue about which they were quite knowledgeable and ask us, how would a feminist foreign policy change our approach to this issue? And so what we did is set about to find diverse expertise, people who were experts in various topics, to do that work of delving deep into what a feminist foreign policy approach would mean for that issue at hand. So today I'm extremely pleased to be joined by on the panel by 4 authors from the Issues paper series who are going to bring their papers to life for you this morning. I'm almost done scene setting, I do promise. But I was reminded yesterday that sometimes we're in the same conversation, but we're not in the same conversation. So I thought it would be helpful just to start with a definition of feminist foreign policy so that we can all hopefully enter the discussion from a similar starting point. So in critiquing feminist foreign policy, it's often invoked as something that you do to other people, but that is a fundamental misunderstanding. It is, in fact, the embodiment of living your own national values through an approach that shapes 3 fundamental elements of foreign policy. The first is how you understand the world around you. The second is how you determine the options that you have for engagement. And the third is how you show up in the world and realize your values through your practice. So Australia doesn't have a declared feminist foreign policy, but in 2022, they declared a First Nations foreign policy approach. In a settler colonial country like Australia, First Nations justice is a critical component of any feminist approach. And so as the AFFPC and IWDA were incredibly supportive of a meaningful implementation of this First Nations foreign policy approach. And on that note, it's my very big pleasure to tease our upcoming podcast, which will drop in early 2024, called EFIT, a First Nations and Feminist Approach to Foreign Policy. Our host will be First Nations woman Julie Ballingarry, who's a member of the AFFPC core group, who's been collaborating with IWDA and the AFFPC on this podcast, which is really geared towards bringing individuals with lived experience and expertise in First Nations approaches to foreign policy and feminist foreign policy into dialogue with one another to explore the synergies that the 2 approaches have, to look at where they diverge, and to really think about how we can use new and emergent approaches to foreign policy to create more mutual benefit, more inclusion, and a healthier and thriving planet. So please stay tuned for Julie's podcast when it comes out. We'll make sure that we send it around the sector. So that's really it from me this morning. I want to turn over to my colleagues on the panel. And so I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning, who's joining us online from the USA, I believe. So she's in a different time zone. Dr. Elise Stephenson is the Deputy Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership based here at ANU, but as I say, currently overseas. Her research focuses on gender, sexuality, and leadership in frontiers of international relations, including space policy, diplomacy, national security, intelligence, security vetting, international representation, and the Asia-Pacific region. She's a member of the core group of the AFFPC, and she'll be speaking to her issues paper on LGBTIQA+ rights. Elise does have to leave us at 9 a.m. So after her presentation, we'll go to questions specifically for Elise, and then we'll resume the rest of our panel. So the floor is yours, Elise.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be joining you all here today. Just in case we have anyone with visual impairments in the audience, I'm Dr. Elise Stephenson. I have short hair, possibly comically large glasses, and a colourful sweater on today. And I'm joining you here from very rainy and cold Seattle. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled today to share a paper that I wrote with my colleagues, Jack Hayes and Matcha Fornin from Thailand-Myanmar border on furthering LGBTIQ+ inclusion and rights through feminist foreign policy. Now, this paper really came out of some work that I'd done in the Asia Pacific in 2018, and working with and kind of learning from Matcha Fornin, who, if you don't know, is a phenomenal LGBTIQ+ or lesbian human rights defender who works at the border of Thailand and Myanmar, specifically with First Nations, LGBTIQ+ and gender minority individuals. And one of the things that she said to me the very first time that we met really stuck with me and was the first kind of inspiration for this paper. So I'm going to go to it in a second. But what she said was the problem with international development is that some human rights defenders are sexist, some feminists are transphobic or homophobic, and some LGBTIQ+ advocates are racist. In essence, we have all of these intersecting identities, isms, discrimination and inequality in our international affairs and development work. And we have to get much more sophisticated about the way in which we help people, the policies we create, and I suppose the way in which we do foreign policy and diplomacy and development more broadly. So this issue paper is published, and you can find it online at the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition's website. Today I'm going to walk you through understanding the core problem. How did we get here? Mapping FFP's or feminist foreign policy's engagement with LGBTIQ+ inclusion and rights, some of the challenges and opportunities to pursuing this agenda, what the foundations of an LGBTIQ+ inclusive feminist foreign policy might look like, what could be some key priorities, as well as some reflections on where we've come since we wrote that paper almost 2 years ago to today. So to start with, you've heard from Matcha Fornin, but to kind of start with, I suppose, to understand that problem, we know that LGBTIQ+ people, perspectives, rights and inclusion have often been highly marginalised in international affairs and invisibilised. It's not just conservative states, however, who have pushed back on supporting diverse folk and their perspectives. We note that progress isn't linear. It can often be static, and we can see a lot of regressions. And we've seen this similarly with gender equality across the last few years. A feminist foreign policy approach, as Jo mentioned, that kind of emphasizes the need to transform global systems which uphold and perpetuate different types of inequality. That includes patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, as well as a lot of other problematic isms. Yet, what we've seen to date is that feminist foreign policy and this idea that we can apply some sort of feminist principles to our foreign policy has not been well applied to LGBTIQ+ inclusion or rights. And indeed, in cases, it's been quite a binary approach and quite a limited approach to transforming foreign policy, often a kind of add gender and stir rather than fundamentally rethinking, well, how might we do foreign policy different? To have a quick look at the criminalization of LGBTIQ+ people worldwide, we note that around 70 countries worldwide have some sort of criminalization. That varies from death penalty, for instance, even in our own region, Brunei, for instance, although there's been a kind of a moratorium on that, right through to, kind of lack of rights, particularly for trans people, for same-sex engagement, attraction, all kinds of things. A huge percentage of those who are criminalizing these activities are within our own region as well, Asia Pacific, and we have a long way to go. And even countries that don't outright criminalize LGBTIQ+ identity or activities still have huge numbers of policies and social kind of barriers to kind of existing safely and respectfully in a society. We know that LGBTIQ plus people face everything from inhumane conversion therapy practices, an increased risk of violence in day-to-day life, targeted terrorism, high rates of mental health issues, bias and discrimination in all kinds of employment, as well as social and other sorts of spheres of life, as well as limited access to certain rights, particularly around health, employment, and relationships. It's important to note that this is even without being in a kind of conflict situation or in a crisis situation. So once we apply things like climate change, COVID, a war or outbreak of localized conflict, this can be exacerbated, some of these challenges. So we know that in conflict-affected states, LGBTIQ plus refugees and asylum seekers are often subject to extreme harm, stigmatization, sexual and gender-based violence, abuse by or lack of protection from security forces, arbitrary detention, and exclusion from essential services, including at times even services that have been kind of provided as part of UN peace and security or other foreign policy and development initiatives. So any binary view of what a woman is, for instance, that might not include trans people or non-binary people, for instance, can leave people who are often in incredibly vulnerable positions already outside of kind of formal structures of support. When it comes to Indigenous LGBTIQ plus people, gaining free, prior and informed consent is also a challenge, particularly with regards to some development projects that impact their livelihood and territories. What we know is patterns aren't predictable though. So in Norway in 2022, there was a deadly terror attack on LGBTI communities as part of Pride parades. Since 2018, the United States introduced or changed kind of the visa rules to mean that anyone applying for a visa to come to the United States who wanted to bring their partner on a partner visa had to be married to that partner. Now, this affected a lot of people. I'm in the US right now, it affected me, but it affected diplomats, defense folk, a whole range. And it essentially means that if your country, your home country, doesn't allow same-sex marriage, then you cannot bring your partner under a partner visa. And these are things that are still active today. It hasn't been repealed since we had the Biden election. In general, difficult to generalize and apply one size fits all policy, but we know that there are a lot of similarities in treatment across different countries. Another point to understand is that different cultures have different approaches to gender and sexuality. This isn't some kind of woke agenda. We're talking about lots of countries worldwide that have had, huge histories of gender and sexual diversity. Often, these have been fundamentally transformed and damaged by colonial concepts that have been imported, as well as legal and policy structures that have kind of enforced a gender binary and an LGBTIQ plus exclusion. And really, when we come to foreign policy, this whole idea of operating based on national or cultural stereotypes and assumptions, and that all cultures are presumed to be homophobic by default, well, that's problematic. It fails to acknowledge the wide spectrum of attitudes, histories, and cultural practices across a diversity of communities worldwide. Further, we have over 32 countries, or roughly 32 countries worldwide, that have now legalized same-sex marriage. So we've got a huge number of countries who are really pro-LGBTIQ plus to a degree. So we need to be able to talk to, work with, and create foreign policy that resonates across these countries. So there's lots of alignment with feminist foreign policy, being able to, remedy silences, increase representation, transform power structures. Yet to date, gender is often equated with women. Foreign policies are still operating in the binary, and LGBTIQ people are often absent. We know that there are tangible benefits, though. This includes increasing states' credibility and reputation in the eyes of interlocutors. It is an investment that is also quite necessary. So we've got data from the US, for instance, that as high as 1 in 6 Gen Z adults are identifying as LGBTIQ+. This isn't a fringe group. This isn't a small minority. This is increasingly a large population of our society who feels comfortable to identify. Conflicts in places like Ukraine and Myanmar have also highlighted that LGBTIQ+ are amongst those most persecuted and least supported. So any investments are likely to go a long way. Thinking about some of the backlash to combining these approaches. Well, for conservative states and actors, LGBTIQ+ rights and inclusion are often one of just many issues to be rejected. However, one of the things that we argue is that for such actors, a feminist foreign policy approach is already likely to be quite a radical approach, and therefore including LGBTIQ+ people in this approach isn't actually likely to have a furthering effect on that. So from our stance, we believe that more is lost in excluding LGBTIQ+ people or not explicitly referring to them than is gained by acquiescing to conservative or discriminatory ideology. There's also concerns around inadvertent harm. So a lot of our development policy has a do no harm approach. So we have to make sure that ensuring that kind of LGBTIQ+ people aren't further exposed to harm through the process of mainstreaming their voices. They aren't accidentally or forced to be out. That they are afforded supports and protections that can help them navigate any kind of pressure that might exacerbate existing kind of vulnerabilities or challenges that they face. And it's important to also realize that many LGBTIQ+ folk don't necessarily or haven't necessarily had a good relationship with these sorts of states and organizations in the first place. So LGBTIQ+ people don't owe states anything, but we have to kind of strike that balance between relationships well. Thinking through some of the foundations then, now this is just a starting point, but updating definitions of gender. So ensuring that the work that we do and kind of the policies we create refer to gender as socially constructed and comprising a spectrum of recognized genders across the world. It's not just a male female binary, and in fact to kind of restrict ourselves to that, it's just not factually accurate. So we really need to kind of drill into that and update those definitions. We need to get rid of the binary, so replace language like both genders with all genders, move past talking about men and women to talking about all genders or men, women, and other gender identities, or using gender neutral language in the first place, individuals and people. Ensuring foreign policy professionals have tools and training. So this is really important. If you're going to go out there into the world making policy, helping on the front line, we actually need to ensure that our professionals have the right tools and training to support their work. And finally, investing in research and around LGBTI people, experiences and perspectives in foreign policy, which has been largely under or not done, but could help build awareness of issues and implementation solutions that include them. So I've got a number of different priorities here, but keeping an eye on the time, I'll just give you a high level overview. So make sure you involve LGBTIQ+ led organizations in foreign policy and development policy. Embed LGBTIQ+ expertise. That's not just LGBTIQ+ people, but also people with expertise. Document LGBTIQ+ rights violations. Meaningfully engage with civil society. Leverage existing networks. Review policies and definitions, including, for instance, in humanitarian and international development policies, what supports are available to families and couples, and do they include LGBTIQ+ families and couples that might be different from your average nuclear family? And then apply a LGBTIQ+ lens, like you might apply a gender lens to review kind of current activities and so on. Thinking about some specific issues that are priorities right now, we have trans rights, banning conversion therapy, repealing laws criminalizing same-sex relations and transgender identities, promoting the availability and access to same-sex marriage, reviewing laws on the medical emancipation of intersex people, safeguarding freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and more. So talk with LGBTIQ+ communities and civil society, ensure that there's really strong linkages between them and the work that you're doing. Just some final reflections. So since we wrote this, going back to one of my points there on kind of leveraging existing networks. So at World Pride, Sydney's World Pride earlier this year, DFAT announced that it was drafting its very first LGBTIQ+ strategy, which is currently under consultation. Just in this last month, DFAT has also published the very first account of LGBTIQ+ diplomats in Australia that has been formally published by the department and authored by former diplomat Rhonda Pigo. We also have our first lesbian foreign minister, of course. And so these are all great things, I think, to be celebratory of, and evidence, I think, that we are moving in the right direction. However, there's also evidence of backlash and backsliding internationally. Conflict is threatening pockets of progress. Climate change and AI has not adequately considered impacts on LGBTIQ+ communities. We have so much more to discuss. So hopefully this has kind of provoked some new lines of thought, but I welcome any questions and comments, and I'm really sorry that I can't stay any longer than 9 this morning.
Thank you so much, Elise. Join me in thanking Elise. So she has 4 minutes before she goes to her next presentation. What questions would you like to ask Elise? Yes. Oh, we need the mic so she can hear you. Yeah.
This is working. Thanks for your presentation. That was fabulous. I'm asking a question really on behalf of a PhD student of mine who's writing about LGBTQI refugees and the experiences that they have in the world. And I'm just wondering if you've got any specific recommendations related to asylum seeker LGBTQI folks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Your PhD candidate's probably aware of specific LGBTIQ+ refugee organisations that have been quite active in particularly removing people from conflict-related situations and helping them get appropriate visas and the rest. And I think there's some great research coming out of Canada already around that. In general, this seems to be an issue or a kind of a challenge that a lot of states haven't fully grappled with. So there's a lot of policies and protocols, like simple documentation issues, as well as lack of understanding. I do a lot of work in security vetting as well, and there's a lot of vetting processes that are very similar across, vetting refugees in terms of visa status and, all of the rest, as vetting people to go into kind of national security work. So a lot of the work that we've been drawing on there has really highlighted the fact that, people who are conducting assessments don't always have the knowledge, skills, training, and tools to be able to effectively, assess applications and to be able to provide supports for really specific backgrounds and identities. So that would be one area that I would suggest does need a lot more research in and tools and resources that could help practitioners. But yeah, very happy to chat offline if you want to reach out with more questions.
Thank you. Elise, do you have time for one more question? There's one more hand up in the room.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we're just getting a mic to that person so you can hear them.
No worries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. My name is Enda Agustiana. I'm from Indonesia. One of the suggestions is mentions that we need to use the gender neutrals approach in some of the language, for example. So it reminds me back to, like during the 90s or something, that during the feminist movement, that is gender neutral is one of that we are trying to avoid it, because once we don't mention women, for example, then that will be lost in the middle of somewhere. So one of the feminist movement that that's why like the word, or really have to state a woman's empowerment, something like that. But given the sensitive issue, for example, the issue of LGBTIQ in Indonesia, that is could if we use a gender neutral, for example, it doesn't even help the other side of groups, a marginalized group in Indonesia. So in this context, in what situation and conditions that kind of suggestion or advocacy can work, especially within the particular context in Indonesia? If you can provide us an advice, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. And you hit on a really good point. We don't want to kind of make invisible gender through using gender neutral language. I think it's always contextual, right? I think that in the place of binary language, I'd rather use neutral language. But maybe best practice is when we can talk about things like gender equality or equality for all genders. And, I try to just make really small changes rather than saying both genders to all genders, or talk about, gender diversity. And this is really tricky in a lot of the work that we do. I mean, I'm part of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. It's right there in the title. However, we reinforce it's hard to change institutes' names. But we reinforce through all of our work that we focus on women and minoritized genders, and we just keep on reinforcing that. We really try to make it upfront. So I don't think it's easy, and certainly we're doing work in Indonesia right now, and there's been a lot of kind of pushback against any suggestion that we change gender norms, or that we tackle issues of gender equality that can raise more alarm bells than, for instance, empowering women, which is just seen to be, well, we'll help women, but we won't actually fundamentally transform other gendered systems. I don't know that I have particular advice, only that I think that we have to continue to push forwards for the standard that we want, rather than acquiescing to the standard that we think people will accept, because otherwise we may as well have admitted that we're giving up before we've even started. So it is difficult. You will find there are times and places where you need to use some language over the other, but I really firmly believe that we have to get much more smarter and much savvier about the way that we do gender equality advocacy and LGBTIQ plus advocacy and all the rest. And to stand down and be silent does not help us. So thanks for the great question, though, and thank you all for your time here today. And I'm very sad I can't stay for more discussion.
Thank you so much, Elise. We appreciate that you have other things to run off to. So we'll let you drop off the screen, and maybe everyone just wants to thank Elise one more time.
Thank you all. Bye.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker this morning, and author of Issues Paper number 6, Dr. Annabel Dulhunty. Annabel is a lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy, a development studies and social policy scholar whose research interests include the alignment of international development assistance programs with a feminist foreign policy agenda and the effectiveness of women's empowerment programs for the most marginalized. Annabel is also a member of the core group of the AFFPC. And Annabel, if you can remember to share a description of yourself, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so hi, everyone. Thank you. I'd first like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose land we are on, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Description of myself, where I've got brown hair, I got too many wrinkles at the moment, and I have amber beads on and a purple dress. So I've been asked to talk a bit about the issues paper that I wrote, which was around a feminist approach to overseas development. And it's really been looking at the aid sector, and it's very timely when we see, the introduction of the new international development policy as well in Australia. So first of all, just wanted to start with this slide. Apologies that there's a lot of text. You don't have to read it all, but just to I guess, back up what Joe was saying, that at its essence, and I think what this group believes in as well, is the idea that a feminist foreign policy is essentially a radical call. It's not about just adding more women, also as Elise mentioned, but it's much more about looking at systems of power. It might seem a bit overwhelming when you look at definitions like this, when you're looking at scrutinizing the destructive forces of patriarchy, colonization, heteronormativity, capitalism, racism, imperialism, and militarism. I can't even say it all. But at essence, I think it is core to think about it in terms of looking at structures of power. And also to think of it as in terms of being an ethical, taking an ethical stance. Now, of course, many nations might adopt a feminist foreign policy, for political reasons, to boost their sort of image, to gain soft power. But at its heart, what we're advocating for is not that, but around the ethical stance of feminist foreign policies, and that they are intersectional, that they go beyond women, that it is based on a process of being reflexive and acknowledging that you don't always have the answers. There's also substantive representation as well, not just of women, but of diverse genders and other marginalised groups, and that it's around accountability and a commitment to peace. So just to highlight, and Joe mentioned that, there's been a large amount of countries who have adopted this. Most recently, I think, I could be wrong, but at least this was very well highlighted, and there's still a lot of materials coming out of Germany. The German government, and this was also with a lot of activism from civil society as well in Germany, developed their first feminist foreign policy. And with it, they've set clear guidelines, and it's something to note as well, because there's quite a few good resources on this. So just to note, if it's something you're interested in, can be looked up. So there's been, with our group, but with others as well, there's been a lot of calls for Australia to adopt a feminist foreign policy. And so why is this? There's multiple reasons. So first, I want to acknowledge that there has been, there are a lot of amazing people within DFAT, for example, within the gender branch. There are many working, throughout the organisation and throughout other parts of the foreign policy body as well, who are very receptive to gender equality and to the idea of promoting that. So I don't want to not acknowledge their good work. But when we look at, Australia compared to other OECD nations, we see that in many ways Australia is, around the middle, but also lagging. Certainly not a leader in this field. And you look at examples as well, just of the funding to women's rights organisations. You look at the statistics based on OECD reporting for both gender as a primary objective and as a significant objective, and you see that it doesn't really match up in many cases with other nations. So there's been, and you might have seen as well, like in the news when they were reporting the new international development policy, it was a lot around, it's gender and climate is boosted. And to an extent, there is much more of an emphasis on gender. It's definitely sprinkled throughout the document. You can see it in both the forwards of Penny Wong and Pat Conroy, and it's throughout. And so just to highlight, I guess, some of the things that, will be developed as well. There'll be a new gender strategy, as well as the LGBTIQA+ strategy and disability inclusion strategy. And there'll also be a commitment to ensuring that all programs over 3 million include a gender equality objective. There's the reintroduction of the internal target, which aims for 80% of all aid programs to address gender equality. So this is okay. This is some decent targets. But when I was reading the different critiques around it being different promotions of this policy being a real gender-focused strategy, sort of like, well, yes, there's some wording around that, but what is actually in the document? And we see as well a sort of lack of key targets around gender equality being a primary objective. So my key concern with that is that when you're, I mean, it's a bit technical, but when you're looking at gender equality and you're measuring it and you're going back and you're saying, well, how much does this make a difference? If you're not looking at it as a primary objective, if you're only looking at it as a sort of a step below as like a significant objective mixed with other things, then essentially it's very easy to say that gender equality is part of any program. You can say it's a part of a water program, a food security program, and the extent to which it's easy to sort of do, I'm not saying that anyone would do dodgy accounting, but the extent to which it is possible is much higher. So I think it would be much more impactful to set objectives around having gender equality as a primary objective. For example, France is committed to ensuring that at least 20% of projects have gender equality as a primary objective by 2025. And also setting targets, it's not just about a focus on gender equality, but also what does this mean? And one key point is around what does this mean for women's rights organisations? The other key point I just wanted to make, and I make that in the issues paper, is it's not just around funding targets. It's also around what does it mean to promote gender equality, to look at issues such as women's empowerment, and to have a real gender lens on the Australian aid program. So my argument is that it must go beyond this kind of reverence for the idea of economic empowerment. So in under Julie Bishop, of course, there was great emphasis given to focus on gender and on women's empowerment. And though the strategy then, the gender strategy that was released, did have a number of pillars, it was really throughout the document, it was all around women's economic empowerment and all around the idea of smart economics. So smart economics is essentially where you aim to empower both women, and through empowering women economically by giving them money, access to credit, it's all very money related, getting them into paid employment, then you can boost the economy. But what comes out of this essentially is, a multitude of things. First, I argue that it's a false causality to think that by giving women money or access to employment or access to loans, it just automatically equals empowerment. There's missing causality in the chain. I'm not arguing that it's necessarily bad. In some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad. It's great for entrepreneurs, it's great for certain groups of women, it's great in some cases if it's done holistically. But you can't assume it's just an automatic causality. So I'm hopeful that the new gender strategy will go beyond that. However, if you look at many of DFAT's investments, many of them are around a kind of smart economic version of women's empowerment. And this matches not just DFAT, but many global multilateral funders as well. And of course, smart economics was coined by the World Bank in its 2012 Women in Development report. So anyway, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. And in addition to going beyond economic empowerment, I argue that it should be intersectional, looking at marginalised groups, whether that's LGBTQI plus groups, whether that's people with disabilities, but also looking at poorer women. That's the other thing that strikes me in a lot of programming too. It focuses on middle class or lower middle class women and business linkages. Now, this might be seen as an easy win, but if we're thinking about an aid program and an ethical imperative of an aid program, be interesting to see how much of it actually goes to those who are suffering poverty and particularly extreme poverty. So, and just to flag that in some of my work as well, also looking around the intersection of this with different structures of care, social reproduction, and acknowledging the work of women behind the scenes and other marginalised genders as well. So thank you. That's just a brief overview and happy to take questions after. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Annabel. We're going to hold questions now until we've heard from all of our panelists who will be staying for the rest of the time. Oops, no worries. Phone, notebook. So I'd like to move us to our third speaker, Dr. Faroo Akbari. Faroo is joining us online, and she has written multiple issues papers for the AFFPC, and she'll be speaking about two of them. So Dr. Akbari's research focuses on diplomatic actors and peace settlement negotiations with non-state armed groups. Faroo completed her PhD in diplomatic studies here at the ANU at the Coral Bell School, examining the required characteristics for non-state armed actors to engage meaningfully in diplomacy for the purposes of peace settlements. And she focused primarily on the Taliban in Afghanistan and Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So I'm going to hand over to you, Faroo, and if you can remember to do a self-description. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo. Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful to be part of this wonderful panel. To describe myself visually, I'm wearing a clear frame glasses and a polka dot black top, and I'm joining you via Zoom from Melbourne. As mentioned, my presentation is based on the briefing papers that I have been co-authoring with Professor Jackie True, one last year and one this year, and we really targeted into looking at the situation of women in Afghanistan and then actions that could be taken. This year in particular, we looked at a gender apartheid concept and also what foreign policy responses options could be. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes that I have, in three parts, I will try to present to you the core argument of the paper and also make some practical recommendation. To understand about the situation, as many of you might be aware, it has been about 2 years and 4 months since the Taliban took over Afghanistan, when the international troops decided to withdraw in August 2021, and within a span of hours, the government of Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, collapsed. It did not happen overnight, but it was a cascade of the collapse of the country, as the army became demoralized because of the so-called peace agreement that the United States and the Taliban signed in Doha in February 2020. And since the Taliban took over, as it was expected, the situation of women and girls became more critical day by day. As a result of this irresponsible withdrawal, the Taliban returned as victors, as people who have won the war over the international forces, and they reversed all the gains that were made in terms of protection of rights or codification of gender equality norms that we had in the constitution, and practical progresses like opening of schools, universities for women, and women were able to work. All of these changed for women within a span of hours. Since Taliban came to power, they still don't have a constitution, but they have been reissuing edicts that sort of define their policy. And out of the 80 edicts that they have issued in the last 2.5 years, 54 of them has been about women, about restricting every aspect of women's life. Afghanistan is the only country in the world now that a woman or girl beyond age of 12 cannot go to school. Secondary schools are closed. Women cannot go to universities. Women cannot work apart from limited healthcare sector with so many challenges that they face. But all other, like no woman is in the government, in all other bureaucratic sort of layers or system in any parts of the country. Women cannot travel on their own beyond 40 miles, and they need a male guardian with them. They cannot even leave the country because you have to have somebody with you, a male guardian, to be able to do so. And basically, women are and girls are imprisoned inside the country. inside their homes, and in every layer of life, male or men are given the authority to dictate and to police over women. For example, a taxi driver has to decide whether he wants to take on a female passenger by looking at her clothes. If she has the full hijab, according to the Taliban, Afghanistan is an Islamic country and hijab was always there, but it is the version that the Taliban require, which is covering in blue burqa or the black head to toe, covering your face. And here, everybody, like even the taxi driver, will decide on such small practical sort of day-to-day things. So the international wars that was fought in Afghanistan, which is sort of being declared that have ended in August 2021, but the war against women and girls has escalated. And the situation of women is not counted as a continuation of war. And we hear so many narratives in the international media, including international diplomats and policymakers, that Afghanistan is at peace, relative peace, which by them mean absence of those visual physical violence like bombs and bullets, but the situation of women does not extend to that definition of war, which is problematic. But as a result of this situation, women in Afghanistan have been resisting. There are protests from the day of takeover until now, ongoing protests. Whoever go to these protests, women and girls, it is at risk of their life. These women, most of them have been, whoever go to this protest are later taken into custody, and there are rapes in custody. There are honor killings, and also a lot of torture. There are no sort of proper mechanism in place to track, but what we hear from our network, our families, and our works on the ground, that suicide rate is increasing, especially among young girls who cannot go to school, and also young women who had so much aspiration and were educated to change and to aspire, their vision, are now imprisoned. So in this such a dire and dark situation that I try to give you a glimpse of it, there are international responsibilities, especially for states with foreign policy principles, and also states that codify pro-gender equality norms in their foreign policy, to hold perpetrators of gender-based violence accountable, and enforce the Resolution 1325, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The case of Afghanistan is a very difficult one on gender. There are a lot of challenges for women everywhere in the world, including in Australia. And in Afghanistan, it's so tense, it's so dire that states are looking away from it. But at the same time, for us, I think it's also a real test for the world, and also for those who say that they have a commitment for women's rights, that what are they able to do about such a dire and such a large scale violence against women. In the second part, I want to talk about the concept of apartheid. This is something that we have been using in our paper, and it makes the case that governments who claim to prioritize gender equality, and or even those who employ a feminist foreign policy, must use the concept of gender apartheid to tackle the situation of women in Afghanistan. So gender apartheid, it means that, what it means, it's a new concept relatively, but what we want to say by this is that it captures when perpetrators seek to maintain a form of governance designed systematically to oppress women and dominate another gender or group, so that they benefit from such subjugation. Gender apartheid is not recognized under international law. The apartheid regime in Afghanistan, and it needs its own analysis, its own legal analysis, and to understand the case more. But in light of the historical example of the racial apartheid in South Africa, where states parties declared that apartheid is a crime against humanity, activists and also scholars like us, we take inspiration from the case in South Africa to be able to frame the seriousness of crime that is happening in Afghanistan. In many ways, there are others that say the situation of a woman in Afghanistan, the gender apartheid is much worse than racial apartheid, because it's not only limitation on rights, but it's a removal of all basic fundamental rights. And we argue that, and also the women activists in Afghanistan, that only through a framing such as gender apartheid, we are being able to tell the scale and the depth of discrimination and crime that is happening against women. So it is also, for us, it's important to say the word gender apartheid, as mentioned, for the seriousness of the crime, but also to bring responsibilities to states to act on it. Racial apartheid was brought down and criminalized because of the various forms of resistance that emerged inside the country in South Africa and also outside. It was also, we saw a lot of international social movement against apartheid, which involved diverse range of actors, and strategies were adopted, such as boycotts, sanctions, protest, solidarity campaigns, diplomatic pressure, and targeted humanitarian aid. So a kind of a mass mobilization against apartheid isolated South Africa from the global community, and that exposed the human rights violation and also the legal action that was taken. So using this same language in Afghanistan, I think, is a powerful way to shame the Taliban regime and its supporters and prevent it from being normalized, and also bring together all the international voices to tackle the regime in any way possible. I'll share 4 recommendations in line with a feminist foreign policy approach for all state and non-state actors who are committed to gender equality. First, to urge the Security Council to impose sanction on the Taliban for the gender-based violence in Afghanistan. The current sanction on the Taliban are not targeted on those who are writing these edicts or who are responsible for it. Taliban is like a very loose networks, a very loose movement. So it has to be a targeted sanction. Number 2, protect women rights activists in Afghanistan and those who have fled to the neighboring countries. This involves facilitating their escape to regional countries and also by negotiating diplomatically to grant them visas, providing financial assistance to these women activists and their families. As mentioned, those protesters, the women protesters, who are the only one right now in Afghanistan that are resisting the Taliban. There are many thousands of them. And as mentioned, they are going through very, very tough situation. Many have been killed and many are escaping. Many have hidden underground and some have escaped to neighboring countries, but they have received no support. And this is something practical that could be done. Number 3, universities and other institutions of higher education should support the education of girls in Afghanistan by offering them scholarships and student visa to study abroad. As mentioned, in Afghanistan, any girl beyond the age of 12 cannot go to school or universities. 2.5 years might not be too long, but for the girls in Afghanistan, that is 2.5 years of schooling or universities. And the fact that they do not know how long this regime will last and how your life will keep going, right? So that's why there are so many early marriages in these girls, because they are forced marry and go and do other things in life because they cannot study. And I think our universities have a responsibility to offer or dedicate scholarships for these students. Right now, universities providing any scholarship for students from Afghanistan, men or women. And number 4, support and facilitate dialogue among Afghan women to mobilize both within the country and exile to shape the future of the country after the Taliban. And this kind of supported dialogue can support women from Afghanistan in exile, like in diaspora or in the country. There are ways to do in the country as well to talk about themselves and to find ways. I think it's very, very critical for women to be supported, to come together. I think that's it for my paper part. And thirdly, I just wanted to quickly...
Faroo, it's Jo here. Sorry. I'm going to get you to hold it there actually for time.
Okay.
And so that we have enough time for questions at the end. But I do encourage everyone at the Q&A to ask Faroo about the impact that she's experienced through producing these issues papers, because I know she has an important story to tell. But let's thank Faroo for right now.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite our final panelist for this morning up to the front. Joanne Crawford has worked at the intersection of research, public policy, and advocacy across government, civil society, and universities. She's currently the special advisor to the Equality Insights program at IWDA and my fabulous colleague. And she's led the growth of IWDA's research and policy arm and made a sustained contribution to the Australian development sector's efforts to strengthen the focus on gender equality and on evidence-based policy and practice. Over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Jo. Can I just say for visually impaired and those who are not looking, that I am an upper middle-aged woman with short grey hair, black rimmed glasses and a black top. As I think you've heard across a number of presentations this morning, what feminist foreign policy does is put different kinds of issues in the frame, raise different kinds of priorities, and address a range of silences. And I'm looking at the way in which this plays itself out in our measurement systems, and in particular, the measurement of the relationship between gender and poverty. So this is just a very brief outline of what I'm going to cover. Can you just excuse me for 1 minute? I'm not seeing notes up on my little screen here. I can work without them, but if you can address it, that'd be good. Yeah. Thank you. Isn't it? Oh, okay. All right. So these are the kinds of things that I'm going to cover. And in particular, I want to look at the way in which our current measurement systems effectively invisibilize gender and then make it systematically difficult to address. I look at the way in which part of the leadership that's required in shifting the ways in which systems change is often developing different ways of doing things, and then addressing the politics of doing that. So what you see on the screen here is a graph that tells us that extreme poverty went up in 2019. But who's affected? Who's most affected? We don't know. Current routine poverty measurement can't tell us because it measures the poverty of households. It's quite extraordinary, really. And what this does is effectively invisibilize the situation of individuals inside. Poverty measurement, predominantly by assessing the circumstances of households, means that we can't systematically examine the way in which poverty plays out and varies by sex, by age, by disability, by other kinds of individual characteristics. Also, by measuring poverty between households, it's ignoring poverty inside households. And that's not a marginal issue. That results in a systematic undercounting of poverty and inequality by around 1/3. That's not my analysis in saying it. This is Rabi Khanwar, who used to head the World Bank in Africa and has done a range of work with the World Bank to understand systematically the kinds of ways in which poverty is found inside households. And when you measure between households, you are effectively ignoring that. What that means is that the data that is presented as accurate and universal and is in driving investments in poverty, and that also drives assumptions about how GDP converts into welfare outcomes for individuals, is really quite inaccurate, but remains presented as though it is accurate and complete. To compound some of these problems, key surveys that underpin, for example, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, so that's the Demographic and Health Survey, and the Multiple Indicators Cluster Survey. These are broadly used surveys to populate the global Multidimensional Poverty Index. Those are repurposed surveys of women of reproductive age. What that means is that there is no data about women over 50 informing those poverty estimates. It is precisely the age cohort whose cumulative impact of inequalities over that time make them among the most deprived actors in the system. So there's some really, this isn't a marginal or a minor problem, is what we're trying to say. And measurement, I think, is often thought as a technical problem. It's the data, we've got lots of numbers there, but in fact, it's deeply political. What we measure determines what's available and visible as evidence in the data that's used by policymakers to drive decision-making and to set priorities. So this is a deeply political question. Data also reflects the systems in which it's emerged. And in the case of measurement systems, often those are decisions that were made in the past. So it extends the long shadow of gender inequality into the future and into the ways in which measurement systems effectively then underpin systems and structures of gender inequality. So we have these large global systems measuring poverty, but they measure poverty in a way that disappears individuals within that, and then means that that evidence is not available to inform change. It makes it harder for gender advocates sitting around budget tables to say, here's the problem, let me show you in numbers. National women's machineries find it more difficult to make the case for those investments of resources because that data is not there. So, the SDG hub, sdg.org, if you go there, you see the numbers of people in poverty they're using older data still, has fallen. It doesn't tell you which people. It can't tell you which people. It can't tell you whether poverty has fallen amongst some groups more than others. This is really a fundamental failure of systems, and our argument in the issue paper argues that measurement systems are not effectively fit for purpose. This is not an unknown development problem, right? So this problem has been on the agenda for some years. It's most definitely been on the agenda since the 1995 Beijing World Conference on Women. Gender and poverty was the first of 12 critical areas of concern, and the need for age and sex disaggregated data was specifically identified as one of the priorities for national statistics organisations. So at multiple moments since then, in reports of the World Bank, and in particular in its 2018 Poverty and Shared Prosperity report, which did really detailed analysis of some of the limitations of existing poverty analysis and poverty data in relation to the ability to disaggregate by sex and the ability to look inside the household and consider within household disparity, which is evident in other socioeconomic data, but in the poverty data that it is used to make global comparisons and also to inform social protection policies, a range of change investments, this data is just completely missing. So there's been consensus that there are limitations, but then we're carrying on as though that's okay, right? As though, yes, we've acknowledged the limitations and now business as usual is resuming. And part of the reason for that is that there has not been a technical alternative to measure multidimensional poverty at an individual level. So one of the things that feminist organisations often do is that they are the ones who understand the importance of change and are sufficiently invested in that change process to go out and create that space for doing something different. And so IWDA, as part of a range of international research collaborations, set out to do exactly that. So in 2008, which was more than a decade after the Beijing World Conference on Women, and with really limited if any development progress since then on addressing the issues that have been named there, IWDA set out to develop a feasible alternative for individual level measurement of multidimensional poverty that would reveal gender disparities where they existed, right? So not just a measure that could be disaggregated by sex, but one which enabled gender sensitive measurement in the dimensions of consideration and in the indicators to measure those dimensions. So that's just a sort of high level overview of the development trajectory today. On screen, you can see the slides that give you an overview of the dimensions that are measured. So what and how you measure matters. So you need to be assessing at the individual level. You need to be surveying multiple players inside the household so that you understand disparity within households as well as between households. And you need to be considering aspects of life. Thank you. Aspects of life that that matter from a gendered perspective, not just ones that apply to all genders, because gender-specific considerations are often those things that that lead to gender-specific barriers. So we resolved the technical problem. Let me show you why this matters, right? And show you what happens in data. So in Fiji in 2016, we worked with the Fiji Bureau of Statistics. One of the things we assess is exposure to harmful fuel, smoke, harmful fumes. On average at a household level, that's 64 minutes a day of exposure, but this didn't reflect lived realities at all. Men were exposed to 24 minutes a day, women to 105 minutes per day, right? So household level measurement is inaccurate and it does not help you understand who is experiencing the problem and who needs to be targeted in addressing it. Additionally, because you measure multiple dimensions, you can see that this is also connected to health impacts. So women were more than twice as likely than men to suffer health problems. So again, the flow and implications of household level measurement means that you're hiding who is really experiencing some of these issues. Another brief example. So in 2022, last year, shortly after the Tonga tsunami, we worked with the Tonga Statistics Bureau using a new variant developed to enable surveying to continue during COVID, so a phone-based variant. The environment obviously was deeply affected in Tonga by the volcano and the resulting tsunami. At the dimension level, with household and individual questions influencing it, you can see from the graphs that are on screen that there is not much difference by age or by gender. But if you go and look at the individual question and only, and you look at that one, what you can see is that individual characteristics significantly influence the level of exposure. So people have different roles and responsibilities in communities. And so while they might all be exposed to environmental impacts, that has different impacts on their daily lives and activities because they are playing different roles and responsibilities in communities. It also plays out statistically. So this is just for those who are interested. You can do chi-squared tests and see that for women, severe deprivation in the environment is associated with severe deprivation in 13 of 14 other dimensions that we measure, compared with only 6 such dimensions for men. Again, it speaks to the nature of gendered roles and responsibilities. So where does feminist foreign policy come in and what are some of the specific things that feminist foreign policy can do? So it's a framework for elevating this concern from a technical issue to a core structural problem that is slowing action and change. It can also provide, by focusing on different kinds of issues and data, it can provide a way of new data and new language for prioritising different kinds of things for policy actors. The issues paper, outlines a range of practical actions to accelerate change and essentially says this is not a marginal problem, right? Measurement makes visible or invisible key aspects of lived realities that are foundational for addressing gender inequality. And global fora are the mechanisms by which we enact these different priorities, right? So in global reports of record, you put priorities in and then you try to move these through as foundational priorities. At the back of the issues paper, and this is a summary of some of these, are some of the really practical actions that can be taken by countries with declared or aligned feminist foreign policy. So it's possible to shift the kinds of requirements of data that you put in your bilateral programs. It's possible to ask questions of other countries in fora that says, so what data have you drawn on? It's possible to go into the OECD settings and ask for a stock take of the kinds of data that is underpinning, starting to make visible the partial nature of what is otherwise presented as sufficient and adequate, and starting to really challenge the adequacy of measurement standards. And one of the other things that we also did was I'm at time. So just to say that it's been used to inform a range of actions since we wrote it, including a submission to the World Bank's new gender strategy consultation draft. It's also been provided to DFAT to inform some of their work. The thinking is now enabling us to have conversations within DFAT with social protection teams and others, and to start drawing on not just the data, but the conceptual framework of equality insights, to be encouraging countries to think much more broadly about the kinds of barriers that need to be addressed. And there are links on the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition website. Thank you. Sorry, Liz.
Thank you, Joe. I might ask Annabel and Joe to come up here so that they can now see the audience. And is it possible to bring Faroo up on screen? Yeah, we'll have some mics sitting there. So make yourself comfortable, pour some water. Hope everyone's got questions bubbling away. Just because the nature of time, we might try and take more than one question at a go and bundle them together. So stick your hand up and we'd love to hear what questions you have for us. Yep, we've got 1, 2, 3 at the back, and then we'll come back down here. Oh, can you stick your hands back up? There's 2 in the middle here, and then we'll go to the woman in the back in the white and black.
All right, fantastic. Hi, thank you so much for those presentations. My name is Ruby and I'm with the Development Intelligence Lab. And my question is for both Annabel and Joanne. So you've both talked about centering women's rights in governmental approaches and aid delivery, but you've also determined that the correct kind of data is so important for those writing policy and informing decision-making. But often positive outcomes aren't necessarily tangible. So how would you both suggest we go about evaluating progress in equality and empowerment for women?
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you to everyone for the really interesting presentations this morning. My question is for Dr. Annabel. I work in the Pacific, and with the mode of delivery of aid, a lot of aid that goes to women's rights organization is filtered through agencies like IWDA or Oxfam that then have partner arrangements with the local women's organizations. So I'm just wondering, with the figure you presented, is that actually money being given to IWA or these intermediaries, or is it actually money that's going straight to the organizations? And whether you could just clarify that figure. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a woman who had her hand up in white and black, but we have a microphone down here, so we might take Jane's question.
Yes, this is also a question to Annabel. And thank you to all panelists as well. It was really fantastic presentations. Jane Sloan from the Asia Foundation. Curious to know if you really looked at the funding flows from those governments that have either feminist assistance, development assistance policies or feminist foreign policies, thinking about particularly the government of Canada that committed 300 million Canadian dollars to create the Equality Fund, and then further mobilised the UK government to give another 33 million pounds to the Equality Fund, and the potential there of advocating for the government giving a similar kind of amount for similar mechanisms, recognising the power of investing in feminist organisations and feminist movements. And I think to the incredible speaker in regard to Afghanistan, we know that feminist movements and organisations within Afghanistan are still sustaining initiatives to support girls' education and teacher training, but there's hardly any money going because governments aren't committing. It's actually philanthropic organisations, feminist funders. So we need to be getting more money. And so I'm wondering if you've been really looking at those flows and the opportunities for the Australian government in that regard.
Excellent. And we've got a mic back there, so we'll take a fourth question and then we'll let our panelists speak.
Hi, thank you. And again, just I want to say thank you to the panel for 3 really great presentations. My question is to Joanne. You spoke about the sort of fundamental and systemic gap in the in poverty measurement, and obviously changing those global tools is not an overnight process. But you also mentioned at the end, kind of taking forward some measures in, I think, Tonga and Solomon Islands, and just wanting to understand a little bit more about what can be done in individual bilateral programs or at a country level. And I'm speaking as someone who manages private sector development programs across the Pacific and Timor-Leste. What can be done in the coming, sort of few years to try to bridge that sort of information gap that you were talking about?
Thank you. Okay, we're going to let the panelists respond to those questions. Do you want me to summarize them? You were writing them down. Yeah.
So I might try and bring the evaluation question and the final question together in some ways. So look, in relation to evaluation, I'll make a general and a specific point. The general point is that I think that Srilata Batliwala's paper around evaluating women's rights organisations that she did for the Association for Women's Rights and Development in about 2010 was really helpful. It has like 11 points for donors on effectively evaluating. And the standout for me is the importance of qualitative and quantitative data. So, lived experience is embodied qualitative capacity, right? So you look for evidence where you can find it. You set up your evaluation frameworks to collect evidence of the things that matter. And it's not that we don't know what matters for gender equality. We do know those things. And so setting up evaluation to collect that is really important. Evaluation systems to collect that is really important, but also to have embodied lived experience travelling with you, because they are much more able to give you the kind of real-time feedback that's helpful to doing that sort of iterative adjustment of what's working and making the most of development dollars. In terms of quantitative and measuring what matters, I mean, it sounds like a shameless plug, and it kind of is and isn't, right? So something like Equality Insights, which assesses 15 dimensions of life informed by lived experience of 3,000 people who have experienced poverty, and it also assesses financial measurement. Like if you do that as part of your situation analysis in year 1 to generate data that helps you understand the circumstances of target populations, and then at year 5, you go in and look at, well, what's changed? So not the only things you measure, but how have the investments that you've made changed lives and for whom in this context? This would be both addressing some of the evidence gaps and giving you really important information for that. So that's really speaking to the kinds of practical things that you can be doing inside some of these large programs. But we're also trying to work with DFAT now to use, recognising the data limitations, to use Equality Insights as a conceptual framework to point you to the kinds of areas and sectors of investment and the kinds of cohorts of concern that should be guiding thinking, so that you use the conceptual framework when you don't have data, but you also prioritise the collecting of data.
Thank you. Just firstly, in terms of the figure, that's the figure direct, not in terms of partnerships, as far as I understand it, but that's just that one. And then with the question around Canada and other examples, yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, my presentation focused a bit more on Australia, but part of the work I'm doing at the moment is just looking at and tracking
those countries which do have a feminist foreign policy, particularly in the aid sphere, because that's more my area, what has happened, what has changed, what possibilities are there? So I think that's a really good point. And Canada obviously is a big example. So thank you. And in terms of evaluation, just to back what Joe was saying, I mean, I think first have it actually evaluated and have it done, and not as a sort of add-on, and also that those with expertise in the area are doing the evaluation. It's not just, oh yes, well, women were included or something. So yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more round. Oh, sorry, Faroo, did you want to add something?
No, I think all good from my side.
Yeah. So we'll take one more round of questions. We have a woman in a pink shawl and a woman in a
while the
black
mic is
blazer.
going, can I just say that the question of funding really is a critical one, because often the declaratory policy, the emphasis on gender equality leads you to think that a lot of work is being done in this area, and having a look at the funding and resourcing really starts to tell you about the extent to which this can be implemented in practice. And less than 4% of official development assistance is going to gender equality generally, even less to where it's a principal focus, and fractionally less to women's rights organisations.
It's actually 0.36% direct to women's rights organizations. To the woman in the pink
And my
shawl.
question is for Faroo. My name is Ayushi. I'm from India, running an organization called the Gender Lab. I think it was really heartening to listen to the research that you did. I mean, I want to understand what was the mental health impact of doing this kind of research, both for yourself as well as the people that you were getting this information from.
Thank you. The woman in the black blazer.
Well, thank you. This is Hiang from Cambodia. It's really interesting discussions. I was wondering, because most of the feminist foreign policy or development policies right now movement is happening in the developed country. And I was wondering, in terms of engagement with the country from the global south, because mostly those countries, the government are very restrictive or probably also authoritarian, or probably think the term feminist is very radical and probably, resistant to it, and especially thinking it as a foreign term. It's a foreign westernized term. So I was wondering, how are you as movement in this family foreign policy engage or probably include some approach that would allow, when these policies being adopted, allow those countries from the global south to become more receptive to it? And how are you going to work with also the local feminist organizations in the global south together in supporting this movement? Not only that's what's happening here in the global north or western country, but also in support of the global south country as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I might let panelists respond because we're coming right up to the tea break. Yep, Faroo, do you want to go first?
Yep, thank you so much for the very good question. I think on mental health of us researching on Afghanistan and also our research participants. I'm also from Afghanistan originally, so I do have family members and relatives inside the country. Mental health is the neglected topic, first culturally, and as well as the fact that the situation has happened so quickly and it's getting so dire, so intense. There are so many practical urgencies needed on day-to-day things for them over there and for us from here to provide support, that we do not take time for ourselves and to sit back. Looking back, I mean, for myself, 2.5 years, it has been non-stop, and it is taking a lot of toll on us. But one way that I have been able to cope and also to heal is my work in the grassroots. Me and my friends, we have a woman NGO inside the country, and we provide support for work with widow women and girls from vulnerable communities. They're providing traditional skills like carpet weaving, embroidery, employing them, and we try to raise funds for them from our own networks and send them just a small. These are all work that are risky, that are happening underground, but a small way for us to make a difference in their lives day to day is very healing for us, and also provide that sort of space to connect one to one and then make small changes. And for women over there, I realized this, and we have hired a psychologist from the community, a woman psychologist that talk to these women on daily basis and try to provide therapy. It is, I mean, it is, it's massive, the mental health issue of women inside Afghanistan from before, but right now especially, and also there are less and less psychologists and counselors available. It is a very neglected issue, and there are. This is another thing that people can support from outside. Online, people are connected to technologies to try to connect with therapies, and women organization, NGOs can do that to support women inside Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thanks, Faroo. I'm realizing we're right at time. Joe, you wanted to
just
respond?
30 seconds to respond to him. So look, I think power and partnerships. To take partnerships first. So often the idea of it's not our culture or it's an imported idea are used to silence. Culture is not singular. There are multiple cultures that we're working in and navigating. Women's rights organisations and gender equality organisations in countries are often very familiar with navigating the spaces and with ways in which to take these issues forward successfully in their own cultural context. So partnering with those who are knowledge holders in that space is fundamental. And I guess that goes to the question of power and for donors and stakeholders in particular who have convening power in those places. You can do practically, you don't need to always use the language, but actually you determine who sits around the table when you're having these discussions. And you just say those principles that we have are an important part that we will enact in our work, and we respectfully invite a whole range of the voices that we know that exist in this country to sit at the table. So there are a range of things that can be done, I think, without I think Elise made that point earlier on, that this work is very contextual, but we don't want to nobble ourselves by saying we can't raise these things. We can raise these things, and women's rights organisations are raising these things, and there are things that power holders and funders can do to amplify that by where they put their money and the seating arrangements, consultations and discussions.
Thanks, Joe. We're going to leave it there. Thank you to all of our panelists and all of our participants this morning. If you've been inspired by the Issues Paper series and you have a topic that you would like to delve into as an author or a collaborator, please reach out to us. That's always an opportunity, and I hope you take these ideas into the rest of your day today and beyond. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Faroo.
Thanks, Faroo.
Yeah,